Thank you, Claude Grunitzky, True Africa. I'm from Togo. And I just wanted to, speak a little bit dovetailing on what I just heard now about the time is now and the fact that the time is always now. And this is really more directed at our students and the student entrepreneurs, student social entrepreneurs. And I want to maybe speak about my own story, having started as a student, as a 23-year-old, creating a magazine called Trace Magazine, really around the idea that we should have a better portrayal of Black people from Africa and from around the world. And just starting with that passion, that youth passion as a student, and just not really worrying too much about success or failure, but just getting it done, realizing that if I didn't do it, then maybe somebody else might. And so that led to a very successful first venture. Actually, second venture, because the first one actually failed after a year, and we kind of pivoted to a more successful business model. And then so on the back of just having created that magazine Trace when I was 23, launching a few years later, television network called Trace TV, which is now the fastest growing television network in Africa. And the reason I mentioned doing these things when you're young is that arrogance of youth, that can-do spirit of youth, where the stakes are not so high. It's you don't necessarily have children, as mentioned before. You don't have a mortgage. You can take risks that perhaps an older adult might not. So as a young adult, there's so much you can do with that spirit of being a student, of having experimented with fresh ideas and theory, but then bringing them to fruition through actual ventures. And so the fact that I was at age 30 was able to raise $15 million from Goldman Sachs to grow my company is something that came from that. The fact that I was amongst my friends, the only one who actually dared to do it with that whole spirit of just the time is now. And just now, speaking just a little bit about True Africa, it's also about realizing that when you spot a gap in the market, you have to act immediately. And I just started getting really upset about 5-6 years ago when I wasn't seeing very many Africans really telling the African story. I just felt that most of the media coverage on African innovation, African entrepreneurship, African society was coming from Western media companies, BBC, CNN, Le Monde. And I just didn't really see anyone championing young African voices in the way that they should be championed, with true authenticity, with the perspective of a native son or a native daughter. And that's why I created a True Africa 5 years ago. The one kind of learning from my own experience as an entrepreneur, as a Togolese entrepreneur, is that it's always been so difficult for me to attract funding from African investors. I mentioned earlier that the investor for my former venture, Trace, was Goldman Sachs in New York. And the only investor that I was able to, the only funder that I was able to attract for my latest venture, True Africa, the media company that is about championing young African voices, has been Google. And I've tried to convince African investors, hat in hand, presenting to them. And they seem so reluctant to fund these types of creative industry companies that I'm interested in. And I believe that the next generation of student entrepreneurs has to find a way to tell a story that will be convincing to these risk-averse African investors whose future and whose funding the future of the continent actually depends on. So that's just my short intro. So I wanted to share a very personal perspective on doing things now and not waiting, and also having people in your corner. And I wish I had more Africans in my corner when I was starting out. And I'm really happy to see that things are actually changing now. There's actually more solidarity in a lot of these equity movements that we're seeing. So that was just my little conversation starter.